Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Renz's Film Corner, a brand new series I'm going to try and see if I can make consistent, where I basically take a few films from back in the day, some underrated gems, some ones that might not have as much popularity now as they used to, or just things that I think, people might enjoy that they haven't seen before, and I tell you exactly why it is you're missing out, which I'm sure is what everybody wants to hear from me. In the first episode we're going to be covering Clive Barkers Hellraiser, the very dramatic, very gory 1987 horror film. So in 1986, a young up-and-coming writer by the name of Clive Barker decides to write a book called The Hellbound Heart. This book did so well, he was able to convince a film studio and a producer to give him a budget of £900,000 to make a film adaptation of it himself, without any prior experience of being a director, which is definitely quite a gamble, but apparently he had already had a few of his books and his novels adapted into films and was not happy with the job that was done. They were either unfaithful with the source material or whatever it was. So this time he said, nope, I'ma do it. And he did say in later interviews, multiple later interviews, that actually the whole cast and crew were extremely understanding about the fact that he didn't really know what he was doing. But you honestly, based on the final film, you really wouldn't have known that, because I think that film is actually a masterpiece, and here's why. If you're looking at a lot of the original horror classic films, if you were to make the Mount Rushmore of sort of horror characters, you got your Scream, your Halloween, your Friday the 13th, your Freddy the Kruegers, your Freddy Krueger, and often I think a lot of people would probably put Pinhead on that same mountain, and they probably haven't even seen a single Hellraiser film. But the first one especially is really not that similar to the other ones. It's far more of what I would call a psychological thriller. I mean, it's quite disturbing. The Cenobytes, the Pinhead, is not actually a very large character in it. I mean, he's on the poster, but if you pay that much money for makeup on somebody, you're gonna put him on the poster. But of a film that is 137 minutes long, he's only in it for 8 minutes. And it's mostly at the beginning and the end. There's not a lot of Pinhead in the middle. But that's fine, that's good, because I think a lot of films, and the later Hellraiser films, to be fair, suffer from overexposure of their characters. There's a few notable exceptions if you want to look at, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in which case, the latter half of that film is basically just Leatherface screaming, but that kind of works in that context. But in this one, they're more used to establish a universe and a set of rules than they really are to carry any plot points forward. Short summary, basically, these Cenobites, these aliens, are essentially space gimps, and they live off in some weird dimension or planet, it's never really explained in the first one, where they explore all of the sensations I guess you can experience. And after a while, this alien group have lost the ability to distinguish between pleasure and pain. So they're constantly doing both of them, so they're pretty much always somewhere between orgasm and crying, I guess. So a lot of things going through a lot of nipples I've noticed in that film. As beside the point. They have these little boxes, right? They're called lament configurations, and they're little puzzle box, and they're scattered around in the Earth dimension. And if you are crazy enough to pick one up and solve it, they summon the Cenobites into this dimension. They go, you come with us, and they take you back to Gimp World, and they torture you for the rest of eternity, or something along those lines. It starts off with a young man called Frank, who apparently is sort of at his wit's end. He's experienced every pleasure he can possibly feel, so he finds his lament configuration. He opens it up, the Cenobites appear, and they mess him up with some hooks, and they explode him up in his loft, just where he summoned them. They just explode him into nothingness, and that's the end of him, supposedly. Flash forward a few months, and this character, Frank's brother, and his wife have now moved into this house, unaware that his sort of bits of him are under the floorboards in the loft. And they're sort of moving their stuff together, and one of them, I believe the husband, gets a little cut in his hand, and this blood drip is enough to start the resurrection process of Frank. And so to the Cenobites, he is already dead. To everyone, he's already dead, but apparently a bit of blood under the floorboards is enough to start you coming back. And there is a very grotesque scene, which is definitely stop motion animation, but it kind of works really well in this context. It doesn't look, well, it looks janky, but that's kind of the point, where you've got this sort of like moldy skeleton screaming, and as it starts to kind of come up from the floorboards and it sort of fleshes out slowly, and there's a whole bit where it kind of convulses and sort of slots its neck onto its skull part, and very slowly sort of turns more humanoid till it becomes essentially a flayed human, and Frank is kind of back, and now he's kind of like a skinless zombie living up in this loft. And eventually he's found by the wife, who apparently harbours there's some long-running feelings there, so she agrees to help him try to become a person again by luring men back into their house where the husband is at work, bopping them on the head with something in the loft, and then letting Frank's horrible fingers devour him for their power, essentially. And they have this horrible conspiracy theory, and the daughter is there, and it's sort of becoming more and more suspicious. That's about as much as I'll give you, but that's the premise. And as you can see, not a lot of talk about Cenobites in there at all. But that's kind of fine. They sort of come in and out every now and then. They add context to it, and they obviously provide some cool scenes and some cool dialogue. Especially at the time, most bad guys in films were either silent, strong silent types, or sort of these boring copy-paste speeches about the foolishness of their opponents. So the fact that these Cenobites were sort of presented as quite intelligent and eloquent and almost self-aware, like they don't pretend to be good guys or bad guys, and in their words, they are angels to some and demons to others. They're like a neutral force of sadomasochism. They're like a neutral force of sadomasochism, which is it's an interesting take, especially for the time. So it definitely makes for more interesting watching. And obviously the character Pinhead, who was not actually called Pinhead in this film at all. I believe he's actually credited as lead Cenobite, and in the book he's referred to as the Hell Priest. But the Pinhead nickname kind of stuck around a bit later, and apparently Clive Barker was actually not a very big fan of that nickname. But they did eventually canonize it, but definitely not with his consent. So he wasn't even meant to be the lead Cenobite. But whilst they were applying the makeup to all of them, so there's 4 of them, I believe. There's Chittering Cenobite, who has got this very horrible mouth, so he's not doing any talking. There is a female Cenobite that has what looks very much like female genitals on her neck, and these big kind of cables that came out of her mouth and so on and so forth. And then there was this sort of fat, slimy one that had these goggles on. And it turned out that every one of the other Cenobites' makeup was so intrusive on their faces that they just weren't able to talk. They simply weren't able to deliver dialogue, and Doug Bradley just happened to be lucky enough to be cast with the one that had the pins in his head, which meant that his mouth wasn't too affected, so he was able to talk. So they gave him almost all of the Cenobite-based dialogue, which is how he became the lead one, and then the only one to be in all of the films. In fact, there are 9 sequels. I'll say that again. 9 Hellraiser sequels, and Doug Bradley is in 7 of those. That is quite a good innings. I'm pretty sure that must be rivaling Robert Englund for Freddy Krueger cameos. No, fair enough. And even his costume was apparently not a dream to work with. He has these big black contact lenses in his eyes, so he apparently was essentially blind. And obviously the character has a lot of these sort of leather dangly skirt type things going on. So he was so paranoid about not being able to see the skirts and tripping over. And imagine again, I probably wouldn't want to fall over, even with a bunch of metal things attached to my face, because that's how you get unwanted acupuncture. So as a result, because he was so clumsy and blind, he was missing his marks all the time. He couldn't see when he was meant to sort of see the cross on the floor to stand on, or when he had to be his head in a certain frame or shot, because he simply couldn't see and was scared of falling over, which is understandable. So the whole film really did seem like a real pain in the ass to do, and they filmed the whole thing in 10 weeks, which is quite impressive. I mean, there's not a lot of locations in it, to be fair, but it's still quite impressive. And well, the gamble for everybody paid off extremely well. The budget for the film was $900,000, and it brought back $14 million in the box office, which is especially good if you think about when it was released in '87. So, big, like, revolutionary levels for horror films specifically. In fact, it was obviously very polarizing. A lot of people saying, oh, it's perverting the imagination of the general public. There's quite a lot of gore and sex references and gimpy stuff. A lot of people didn't like it for that reason, but also it was smarter than the average horror film at that time. It was far more thrillery. The dialogue was important. The performances are really good on pretty much every member of the cast. It's all about suspense and building up to these moments where suddenly a character gets horrifically killed, or you see these like horrible gory moments. But because they're sort of scattered in between, and they're very context and plot essential, they have so much more impact to them than something like a Saw film, which, don't get me wrong, I like Saw, but it's a different itch that you scratch with this one. This is the kind of film where you pay attention to it afterwards and go, whew, I kind of want to watch that again, but also I don't know if I can go through that again right now. It's kind of traumatizing. There is literally a scene where a zombie tries to make out with a younger girl whilst wearing the skin of her father's face. That is exactly what I meant to say, and it is as horrible as it's described. Another quick fun fact. So these little boxes, they're called the Minx configurations. They were quite finicky and a pain in the ass to make. They're made of fiberglass and brass, and there's quite a lot of detail on them. They need to move, it's possible to pop them out, pop them back in, that kind of thing. And they were a pain in the ass to make. So there are apparently multiple scenes during the filming of this that probably made it into the final takes, where if you were to pan the camera down just a smidge, you'd see a prop designer holding up his hand in absolute fear, waiting for someone to drop this thing, because there are multiple scenes where either a completely blinded character dressed as a Cenobite is holding this thing and he doesn't know if he's going to drop it or not. And there's also a few scenes where they're sort of chucked around or dropped around, and apparently it was an 8-hour process to replace these things if they were broken. So there's lots of them just sitting underneath waiting to catch one in case it gets broken, which I do find pretty funny, actually. That just about does it really for my thoughts on Hellraiser. If you've got the stomach for it, I really would recommend it. It is quite horrific and more sort of psychologically disturbing than I think you might expect of it, based on how silly the sort of characters can look out from an outside perspective. But it is, the performances are fantastic, the soundtrack's actually very good, the way it's filmed is very artistic, and it's nice to know that the direct creative vision of the person who wrote the book that it's based on was the guy seeing it through to the end. It's the only one of the Hellraiser films that Clive Barker actually directed himself, so you know for a fact that it sort of fulfills that vision. So I really would recommend giving Hellraiser a go. Thank you so much for watching. I've quite enjoyed doing this. I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it too. It's another thing. I'm not going to stop making talking tunes. I'm still going to be making music. I'm just trying to add a few things to the bow, sort of throw a bunch of at the wall and just, see what sticks. So hopefully you enjoyed it watching, and maybe I'll have convinced a couple of you guys to go and watch Hellraiser, which would be mission accomplished. If not, that's fine. Either way, like, share, subscribe. All the other good stuff that all of the other YouTube guys will tell you to do. I know it's good for them, so it must be good for me too. I also do have a Twitch channel. It's under the same name, Spangle Jerps. I'm there a couple of times a week, so that's also worth checking out. At the moment, I'm doing a playthrough of Heavy Rain, and it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. So yeah, check that out. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you on the next one.